Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 6, analyze the challenges faced by the first 5 presidents and how they responded. More specifically, we're looking at Part A of that standard, examine the presidency of Washington, including the precedents he set. George Washington, the most popular and influential figure of the time, was elected the first president of the United States. So, like the Justin Bieber of that day. Just kidding. Being the first president of the United States, there's really no clear understanding of how the office of the president would operate. The Constitution set it up, but there weren't these strict guidelines. Hey, here is how you do it. Washington had the challenge of kind of creating that guideline for himself and future presidents of how the executive branch of the government should operate. During his first 2 terms, Washington set many precedents that remain accepted procedure to this day. Washington's leadership and understanding the critical role he played in shaping the future of the United States created the foundation for success in the new republic. A precedent is an action that sets the basis for similar circumstances as they arise in the future. Washington established important patterns or precedents for future presidents to follow. Some of the critical precedents that Washington established during his presidency were forming a cabinet, using the title Mr. President, using constitutional authority to enforce laws, and retiring after 2 terms. One key development associated with Washington was the creation of the cabinet system. He called on Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton to be the Secretary of Treasury. For all of Washington's experience with constitutional conventions and military experience, he understood that he could use more expertise in government policy. Therefore, Washington created the cabinet system to surround himself with experts in various fields in order to make the best decisions possible in the best interest of the country. The appointment of Jefferson to be Secretary of State is a prime example. Jefferson spent the majority of the Revolutionary War making deals, negotiations with other world leaders in Europe to ally themselves for the patriot cause. Jefferson spoke in 6 different languages, so of course Jefferson had much more international experience than Washington. Therefore, Washington, even though he had much military experience, didn't share the international diplomatic experience that Jefferson had. So Washington wanted to use Jefferson as an asset in his cabinet and didn't view Jefferson as a threat to his power. Some leaders could have thought, I don't want to give someone that has high position another high position just to give them more exposure, and now they're going to take over my spot. No, Washington understood we need a bunch of different heads and experts to make the best decisions possible for the country with the cabinet system. The cabinet is a precedent that's been maintained up to today's presidencies. Today, the cabinet is made up of the vice president and the heads of 15 different executive departments. There can also be other advisors that serve a role for the president in the cabinet. During Washington's presidency, he had 4 individuals in his cabinet. Washington's cabinet members didn't always agree on things going on. For example, Hamilton and Jefferson were debating and arguing about the expanding federal power, how much is too much in the use of federal power, and what side the United States should take in an erupting war against France and Great Britain. The challenging debates that took place in these private cabinet meetings helped Washington formulate policy during this critical development of the United States. Not all precedents set by Washington were as policy driven as establishing the cabinet. The proper title for addressing the president wasn't established by the Constitution. A lot of debate and discussion centered on this issue. What do we call the president? Which you would think is a pretty trivial issue, like it wouldn't matter. Some people thought, hey, this needs to be a very dignified, respectful title, very high title for the president. Others, like Washington, believed that the title should be pretty simple to reflect the Republican nature of the government. So to avoid any type of title that would resemble a monarchy like that they came from. So Washington set the modest title, the precedent, for addressing the president as simply Mr. President, and to avoid any title like Your Majesty or Your Highness, Your Excellency. During the early years of Washington's presidency, considerable tension existed between the U.S., France, and Great Britain. France and Great Britain were at it again, and Washington favored a non-intervention approach to avoid siding with France. The U.S. Persuaded Britain to forgive pre-revolutionary debts and to drop certain trade restrictions that Britain had with colonies they still possessed in the Americas. Dropping these restrictions resulted in booming trade for the U.S. with Britain. Washington's new government encouraged Congress to pass taxes on liquor to help pay the states' debt from the Revolutionary War. The tax hit the small whiskey makers in Western settlements particularly hard. The Whiskey Rebellion resulted when armed violence broke out when farmers attacked federal tax collectors. Washington then led a militia into western counties to put down the rebellion. Washington's response set a critical precedent for presidential authority to enforce the law. Another important precedent Washington set at the end of his second term was not to seek a third term in office. There is no provision in the original Constitution limiting the president to 2 terms. It wasn't until the 22nd Amendment was added that the president was limited to 2 terms in 1951. The precedent that Washington set to voluntarily limit it to 2 terms was followed by every president up until Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s to 40s when he was elected 4 times. Washington, as President of the United States, was super popular among all classes of people. So it's fairly certain that he would have been reelected had he continued to want to serve as president. However, he wanted to retire after his second term because he wanted to step away from politics, but he also wanted to demonstrate to the world that power could be peacefully transferred under this new system set up in the United States. He also wanted to emphasize that he wasn't a king and that this Republican system was effective. The precedent that Washington set to limit to serve 2 terms of the presidency lasted for many years. There were a few other important precedents and policy perspectives that Washington held but did not survive beyond his administration. One was he warned against the forming of political parties, and the other was to be careful of tying too closely politically to a foreign nation. Washington addressed both of these issues in his farewell address. In his farewell address, as he was leaving the nation, he warned that the forming of political parties would end up dividing the nation and threaten the nation. When talking about the relationship with other nations, Washington advised to keep the relationships as trading with foreign nations, but to not tie the U.S. close politically with other nations. The political parties that Washington feared formalized soon after his presidency ended, and the political entanglements, the formal alliances between the U.S. and other countries over time formed to Washington's dismay. These issues that Washington wanted to set a precedent for didn't actually happen. Political parties had their origin in the differences of opinion between Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Both had very different ideas on how the new nation should be run, how it should be organized, including the constitutionality of a national bank. Hamilton and his supporters later became known as the Federalists, and they wanted to expand the power of the federal government to stabilize the new nation and its economy. Jefferson and his supporters became known as the Democratic Republicans. Now, they wanted to limit the power of the federal government to only what was described and listed in the Constitution. So the federal government could only do what was listed, described, laid out in the Constitution specifically. Within the foundation of these two groups, so you have Hamilton and his supporters, the Federalists, saying let's expand the power of the federal government. You have Jefferson and his Democratic Republican supporters saying no, let's limit the federal government to only what's described in the Constitution. You've got this situation that laid the foundation for this two-party system. So when Washington announces his retirement, now you have Hamilton and his supporters attacking the Democratic Republicans, and then you have the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson attacking Hamilton, and the Federalists saying, competing, and no, our ideas are better, no, these ideas are better. And now they're competing to replace the presidency. Washington's presidency was challenging in that he was creating the office of the executive while he was in it. Washington's leadership during his presidency led to wide popularity across the U.S. and even spanned across these political opinions that were beginning to emerge. Washington was a leader who understood the importance of the precedents he was setting for the new republic to endure. The voluntary retirement of George Washington as president was a huge difference between the monarchical rule that was common in Europe. The establishment of the peaceful transfer of power was an enduring precedent among many that George Washington set as the United States' first chief executive.